My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I am the CEO of After the Fire. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster: Recover, Rebuild, and Reimagine. In this podcast, we bring you the very best practices, best hearts, and great ideas from other disaster-affected communities. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster. My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson. I'm the CEO of After the Fire. Today's guest is really interesting and a little bit different for us. I'm so pleased to welcome Amy Simpkins. Amy Simpkins is the entrepreneur and founder of MuGrid Analytics, which seeks to take on some of the biggest challenges we have in today, having to do with both wildfires and disasters, and also equity. So I'm going to let Amy explain more to you because it's very complicated, and I want to make sure that she puts it in language that's much easier for our audience to sort of integrate into their thought processes about how we should be approaching disasters and the human condition. Once again, welcome to the podcast, Amy. So I wanted to start off today. You're a little bit different guest for us because we're actually going to be addressing tech and how can technology actually help us in our navigation of disaster, climate change, some of our really big problems in this world. A third of our work at After the Fire is related to resiliency and recovery technologies. And so I love having somebody on who has a very different skill set than I do, who can really translate that for us. So I'm going to read from your bio and you're going to tell me, what does that even mean? Okay?
Sounds great.
Thanks. Okay, so it says that you are co-founder and CEO of MuGrid Analytics. Amy Simpkins solves wicked problems, I love that language, by the way, at the intersection of energy, technology, and economics using math and modeling. Two things I'm really bad at, so I'm so excited to have you on. MuGrid provides bankable techno-economic analysis, optimized control, and project development of renewable energy storage, and microgrids, which we do love. I definitely know what those are, to maximize economic return, increase energy resilience, and promote energy equity, which we love talking about equity in the United States and around the world. You have a master's degree in I almost said astronomical, which would make me sound really stupid.
It's close.
I think it should say, is it astronautical? It's not even aeronautical. It's astronautical. So I definitely want you to define that. Astronautical engineering from USC. I'm also a USC grad for my master's degree, and you have a bachelor's in aeronautics and astronautics from MIT. So it's pretty clear that you are no intellectual slouch. So can you please, why don't you tell us about yourself and what exactly does all of that mean?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. So let's start to talk about what I do right now and what the company does and how it relates to resilience. And then we can talk about kind of how I got to where I am. But so you're familiar with microgrids. You know, the idea of a microgrid is that the primary foundational concept of the microgrid is that it's distributed energy. So instead of the way that we have generated electrical power for 150 years in this country, which is to have a large centralized power plants that are expected to serve a whole lot of facilities, homes, people that might be geographically a really long way away from them. A microgrid is a collection of energy generation and storage and distribution assets that sits together very close to where the energy is going to be used. And so that's a really different architecture from what we currently have in our traditional grid. You won't see any of those really long, high tension, high voltage power lines with a microgrid because you just don't have to move energy over long distances. And we're finding in the space that there are several different reasons to install microgrids. One is the sustainability. Most microgrids these days involve some sort of renewable energy. And that renewable energy can be used whether the grid is up or the grid is down. And so you can be sure that the energy you're using on site is green, is good for the planet. Now, technically speaking, that old propane generator that you had out back of your house, that's a microgrid too. Any kind of generation asset that is locally available to the facility and that you're able to use, when the grid goes down, is a microgrid. But microgrids for our purposes these days usually are multiple assets working together. So generation could be solar or wind, and it could be the propane generator too, working all together. And then there's usually some sort of energy storage, because when you have renewables assets, particularly ones like solar or wind, which are the first ones that pop to mind, you can't tell that energy when to be generated. Mm-hmm. It's there when the sun is out, it's there when the wind is blowing, and it's not there when it's not. And so you have to have somewhere to put it. Otherwise, that energy is ephemeral and it just leaves. Yes. And so usually there's some form of energy storage. The front running technology for energy storage right now is a battery, particularly lithium ion batteries. And there are some economic and technical technical industry reasons why that is, but it doesn't have to be a lithium ion battery.
There's also some environmental downsides to lithium batteries too.
For sure, which is why I will be very excited to see both battery technology specifically and storage technology in general evolve from those. But they're what we got right now. And as a technology, they're very mature because of the way the personal electronics industry has evolved. And so they're available there now, and that's what we've got for the moment.
Let me actually put a pin in that really quickly, because for those people who maybe they've never been through a disaster, maybe they've watched the wildfires on television, but they haven't experienced themselves, but maybe they don't understand exactly what is the danger of having these really old power grids that run hot power lines for many miles over the forest. And I'm sort of leading the witness here. I'm definitely leading the witness, but talk about how that directly relates to our resiliency. Not only is it ecologically better, but how is that a better idea?
For sure. Yeah, no. So so when we say that there's these long power lines that are running, we call that a centralized architecture, right? Centralized generation with these long transmission systems that have to operate at a high voltage in order to push that energy to your house at the end of the line, or whoever house at the end of the line. There's several different reasons that this is just suboptimal for us from a resilience standpoint. And the one that you're getting at is that it actually can turn out to be a safety concern during times when there is high fire danger, whether that's dry weather, low water resource, those, when you have all of that energy in the same place and it's operating at these very extreme technical places, the chance of a spark of some sort is higher there. Mm-hmm. And any chance of spark in those situations can cause havoc on the system. They're also vulnerable to lightning interactions, which can do the same thing. So can actually cause a fire or some form of natural disaster just in the way that they're the architecture of the system. But that's not the only reason they're a threat to resilience. Another threat is that they're vulnerable. Yeah. And so, for example, when we talk about now, Oregon has had its share of wildfires for sure. And so power shutdowns due to fire danger are a thing there as well. Yeah. But Oregon is also sitting in what we call the Cascadia subduction zone, which is a fault line out in the ocean that is years overdue for some kind of massive earthquake. And if and when that happens, that earthquake could either directly affect infrastructure on land, or it could cause a tidal wave that then comes and affects infrastructure on land. And the more you have lines that are strung out over long distances, the more chance you have that some sort of disaster is going to disrupt the line along the way somewhere and cause a disruption for people who are on that line. Mm-hmm. And usually the people who are on the ends of those long lines are, rural residents, farmers, indigenous people who are living on reservation areas and are vulnerable anyway. And then they're the most vulnerable to the natural disasters. And then sort of the final thing I'll say that we're seeing right now in the West is the low water level in the reservoirs. A lot of the power, even though it is clean energy, is coming from hydroelectric, coming from dams. And the dams are operating in a lot of ways at reduced capacity or having to be shut off in the case of the Lake Oroville Dam.
The Oroville Dam in Butte County, and Butte County is very wildfire vulnerable, and that's where the Dixie fire started. It's raging right now. It's very difficult to witness. And I'm actually, as another bonus of you explaining how energy works, we're in the midst of a PSPS right now. Now, not in this office, but several thousand residents in Northern California, including in the valley where I live, currently do not have any energy. And I noticed that on social media, this will bring out a lot of armchair energy experts who've decided that they know the one way that this should be done. And invariably, while they mean well, I've never seen one that's an actual energy expert. And so I just want to say as a side note, thank you for explaining these things, because I think that when it's in the flatlands and you don't feel the wind, it doesn't mean that there isn't 90-mile-an-hour winds at the other side of the grid. I see it like tin can to tin can to tin can, like that's how old the technology is. And that's a big reason why we have to change and be resilient. And undergrounding isn't going to work in all situations. So keep going. But
well, and there's one more. So we've got, so far we've got the actual fire danger of large high voltage equipment. We've got the vulnerability of long duration transmission to other disaster events, including tidal waves, big windstorms, etc. We've got the last one, which was, even though we have clean centralized generation like hydropower, that's still centralized generation, and you're still creating the problems of having to transmit that energy over long distances. And the fourth one is that sometimes the public service power shutoffs aren't a safety issue. Sometimes they're because there's not enough power on the grid. And that's something that's going to be more and more of a concern. And the reason that that's happening is because we're in summertime, and part of the cause of like the fires and the fire danger environment is this tremendously hot weather, especially tremendously hot weather in some areas that don't normally get it, like Seattle. And everyone's cranking their air conditioning all at the same time, and the demand on the system is going up. And now we as Americans, we are so used to such a reliable electrical grid that you walk in your room and you flip the light switch on and the lights come on, and you don't even think about it. And you don't even realize that most of the world doesn't work like that. Most of the world can't always expect their light switch to turn the lights on. Sometimes,
or they have like daily blackouts. Like that's how I remember being in India even 20 years ago, and every night the power would go off for 1 to 2 hours, and it was scheduled. Everybody knew it was coming. But here in this country, many of us don't think about when we turn the faucet on, is that water clean? Is that water going to be there? We also don't think about the source of our energy or our responsibility in conserving it, other than when we get a big bill.
And so as we move as a culture, you'll hear the word in the energy industry, where we talk about renewables and electric vehicles and all of that, you'll hear the phrase electrify everything. And the reason we talk about that is because we want to get off of fossil fuels. That's the best thing for the planet, of course. But once you electrify everything, and that's heating and cooking and transportation are the main things you're talking about there, the load growth on our system is going to be huge, even at a time where we're trying to decommission fossil fuel-based assets. And so how does that work? And so a lot of these public service power shutoffs are because there's just not enough power, which is why you're getting requests from CAISO and stuff like that to please turn down your air conditioning. Everyone limit it to 86 degrees, and we might be able to get through without rolling blackouts, because we need to bring the peaks down for the sake of the system. And that may not be a safety issue. That may be an availability of power issue.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
it does. And I think all of us remember the Enron scandal too. So, I know that here, once we started having PSPSs about 2.5 years ago, I would have been more amenable to going on all electric, but they were lasting up to 6 days. And that would mean no hot water. That means, or if it's already bad if you are in an area where you depend upon a well, because the wells actually are run off electricity. And so there's a whole bunch of ancillary things that we are very dependent on. So I'm interested in your work around finding different ways to increase our resiliency in our everyday lives and help the planet. But, this is obviously called How to Disaster. And, but it's, how do we innovate our way through this? We do not just have to sit back and burn down and, crawl into a hole and die. Like, we can actually innovate our way through this. So talk to us about that space and your role in it.
Well, first of all, I totally agree. You just gave me a huge flashback because I grew up on a well in northwest of Detroit, not even really rural Michigan, but kind of suburban Michigan, but we had a well. And that was actually the biggest fear about like losing grid power was we're going to lose our water, so I totally relate. And you took me back to like 6-year-old Amy, fearing losing the water supply. So
I grew up on a farm with the same thing out in southern Sonoma Valley in a part called Shellville. Now it's called Carneros because it's an AVA, but it definitely wasn't fancy then. And we had regular blackouts. Regularly, our well wouldn't work. And so I totally relate to you on that.
Yeah. So let's come back to the concept of microgrids, because what we're talking about here and where my work is sort of centered, you've seen like large scale wind generation, like out on the plains in Iowa or Kansas. And that's another form of centralized generation. It's great that it's green, but you're still moving that energy over tremendously long distances to get it to an end user. It's not powering those, when you see those turbines that are 50 or 100 megawatts each, they're not running the farm next door. They're moving that to the big cities. They might be moving that to Chicago or Kansas City or,
We actually have a big one here just outside of Livermore, where when you're driving to LA, for example, you can pass huge fields of windmills, and they're pretty spectacular for those people who've never seen them. They're a wonder.
Yeah. And it's so awesome, right, to be putting more renewable generation on the grid so that you can be sure that when you're purchasing from your utility, you're not buying coal or natural gas or fossil fuel based energy, you're buying green energy. That's fantastic, but it doesn't solve the centralized architecture problem. You still have to move it along. And it was sort of, renewables built into the grid that we have. And so talking about microgrids, what that does, again, the shift from centralized architecture to distributed architecture brings the assets closer to where they're used. And that means a greater amount of control. Now, for some, that distributed architecture just means like it could be at the city level, that like instead of your power being produced 100 miles away or 200 miles away, and you don't know where it is, you're like, oh yeah, my city microgrid is out at 4th and Main. Like, I know where that is. It's over there. And it's the ground mount solar that's just outside the city limits that's supplying our energy. It could also be at the building level. It could be at a campus level. If you have a college campus or an industrial park, there could be a microgrid that could serve a small group of buildings. But the point is that it's nearby, it's local, so that you're not blindly waiting for someone to restore service. You don't have any insight into what the timeline is because it's some worker up a pole 100 miles away. You don't know. It also, because microgrids these days are generally incorporating renewables and the distribution architecture to use those in resilience mode when the rest of the grid is down, you can be sure that you always have some energy. Because even, we just finished a large microgrid for a Native American tribe up in northern Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of people who said, northern Wisconsin, like, in Alaska, they're doing a lot of big wind to support islanded microgrids, but they're also still doing solar. Like, it is possible, even at northern latitudes that get a lot of snow, the sun is still there. It's not there as much as it is in Arizona in the summer, but it is still there,
I
And
wonder
so,
though too, if you can, sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah,
when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking that the other day I was watching a John Oliver show on ransomware, and I was thinking about how vulnerable these huge grids are to cyber attacks. And so it seems like another thing we may not think about is building resiliency against cyber attacks may also involve making sure we have microgrids so that we are not as vulnerable to these huge like systems on the East Coast that were shut down and they could not deliver. I forgot what the name of it was. Capital. And I can't remember what it was, but we are not then subject to, we're less vulnerable to ransomware attacks, cyber attacks, essentially.
the caveat I would say to that
Okay.
is that you're right, totally, that you don't have this like where, half of the Eastern Seaboard is, attached to one piece of software
Mhm.
and it gets attacked and then it's down. That's totally true. However, you then start a different cybersecurity problem when you have like everyone has their own controller. And now you have it's sort of like everybody has their own PC at home. It used to be the PCs
Yes.
lived in one giant room at a university, but now everyone has their own PC or their own, MacBook, and everybody's PC is vulnerable. And so you have to have your own copy of virus scan software, and you have to be diligent about updating it and all of that stuff. And so you're trading a little bit one set of
That's a
vulnerabilities for
good
the other.
caveat, though. I think that's a very fair caveat. I think part of the struggle in working in disaster is getting people to really lean into some sort of a form of self-reliance, and that builds resiliency, which means we all have a role to play and a responsibility. And I'm always a little bit amazed by places that are politically, and we don't do politics here, don't worry, but more politically conservative, but then are super angry when the government doesn't show up post disaster to do everything. And it's not that they meant it that way. It's not that they're bad people for thinking that way. It's just that it can be a shock to the system to realize how reliant we are upon certain functions of government or of large scale systems that deliver our comfort and care. That's all.
Totally, totally. And so from a government perspective, again, apolitically, you may have heard there's been some attention these days on an organization that doesn't usually get a lot of attention because they're one of those really boring government agencies that no one knows who works there. It's called FERC, FERC. It's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission.
Oh, I think I just saw something on that. Go ahead, explain that. What do
Yeah.
they do?
So they manage the transfer of fuels specifically, but also energy too, across state lines. And so if there is a pipeline that goes across multiple states, they have things to say about. There's regulations and standards. This is so if there's a pipeline or a high voltage power line that's running from Minnesota into Iowa. Minnesota doesn't use something that's this big, and Iowa uses something that's 5 inches smaller. It's all standardized, and everyone knows what the pressures are and how to make it safe for everyone, and what the voltages are, and who's in charge. And so this is what enables, cross-state wheeling. So you can generate your electricity in Iowa on those big wind turbines, and then you can send it to Chicago or Kansas City, which are both in other states where you need it. And well, Kansas City, split. But the so FERC, our government structure is around this centralized architecture, this historic grid, and we don't have the organizations in place, the regulations in place. And I mean, a lot of people are working really hard to say, what policies should there be? If we do have more distributed architecture, how do we make sure that people stay safe, that we maximize the amount of resilience that's created for communities? And there are people and how do we make those into regulations, laws, policies, sets of standards? That's all being talked about, but we don't have it yet. And so it's interesting because from I understand you're talking about like from the disaster side, having like government agencies come in for relief, but there's also a significant amount of, working with the government around regulations and approaches to making sure energy is able to be supplied. And currently, like nearly all of our policy is around these big centralized architectures and big transmission.
Just one quick thing is that here in California, like all states, we have a Public Utilities Commission. It's called the CPUC here. And they insisted for decades that the energy companies in California, that they push all of their resources towards renewables, which we totally, right on, good job. But then they also said, you know, you may not spend a significant amount of money maintaining your really old grids. Like it sounds logical until you have a mega fire like we had sparked by PG&E lines, you know, and then you have the Camp Fire. So it seemed like a logical decision, but I do think it's important that people do understand a political landscape and how the pressures could be all towards investing in renewables, which we need to be doing. But now we're also having to invest hundreds of millions of dollars of maintaining a system that is totally outdated. And we're in this weird intersection between climate change, renewables, and traditional energy. And there seems to be always a lot of tension there between who's responsible, who's made the decisions. And we argue that people should have a fundamental understanding of what's going on so that they too can be part of the decisions.
Totally resonating with everything you're saying there. And let me bring that back now to microgrids too. Okay. So something that has been created by the massive amount of renewables that's on the grid in California. That's fantastic. Yay, good. Renewable energy, getting off fossil fuels is fantastic. There's a ton of solar on your grid from a utility perspective that's feeding into the utility grid. And so what that creates is when the sun is up, the production or the load on the system is actually very, very low, even though it's the peak of the day and people have air conditioning on because the sun is out. And so you have all of this solar that is offsetting almost the entire load on the whole grid. And we're like, yes, we're going to get to net zero as a grid. But what happens at about 5 p.m., and depending on the season, because the sun does move, but about 5 p.m. is that not only does the sun start to go down, but people who are at work start to get home, right, and they kick up their air conditioning and they start to cook dinner and they flip on devices for their kids or to watch while they're, and there is right now, I just saw this chart, between about 4 p.m. in the afternoon and about 6 p.m. in the afternoon, there is a 13 gigawatt swing in demand because the sun went away, so your solar generation went away. And a bunch of people want more electricity all of a sudden, because they haven't shut off any of the lights at the offices. All that's still on and still running. Yeah. And 13 gigawatts is huge. And so all of a sudden you're like, get the natural gas plant online, get it up. And it's causing a grid instability issue. Okay, so does that mean we should not use renewables? No, that is not the answer to that. The answer to that is in what I do for a living, which is solving problems, wicked problems with math and modeling. And so what we do is we build a model of the system. And we say like, okay, we look at that curve, we look at the data and match the data to what is happening. How do we explain this curve? Do we know what the cause is? And then once we know what the cause is, well, what if we tried this to mitigate it? And we can see through a model of what's happening, how different types of addressing that situation might help it. Now, I don't work very often on the utility side. And so I don't do a lot of grid modeling. I definitely have partners who do that work, who are very good at what they do. I do modeling of microgrids for a single building or for a small collection of buildings. And I would, so I take a look at what is the demand on that building or set of buildings. And if we were to put solar with these buildings, how would that interact with their load? Are they going to have to adjust their operating behavior at all in order to run specifically on their microgrid, like if the grid is down? So there are two modes for a microgrid. There's a grid connected mode that you can be using your own solar power on your roof mostly. And then if you want to purchase some from the grid as well to supplement, when you turn your microwave on or plug in your electric vehicle or whatever, you can do that. That's grid connected mode. And then there's islanded mode. And islanded mode is what we would talk about as resilience mode. That means the grid, for some reason, far away from you has gone down. You don't have power that's serving your facility, but you have assets on site so you can stay up. And that's called islanded mode or resilience mode. And so those are two different operating characteristics because there's two different goals. The goal of resilience mode or islanded mode is that when you turn on the light switch, the light will go on and the power will be there. The purpose of grid connected mode, because you could just buy from the grid, why wouldn't you do that? It's actually an economic justification because you're trying to save money. You're trying to offset high energy charges. And in California, you have some very complex rate tariffs, especially for commercial buildings and industrial buildings coming down into the residential area. But, you know, with demand charges, but not just demand charges at this time of day and that time of day and this time of year and that time of year. And the more complicated the rules get, the more frustrating it is for a customer, but also the more opportunity there is to make an economic play. The computing gets more advanced. What's the best decision I could have made with my energy assets at this moment to make or save money? And that's one of the things we do. So we work on modeling the economic benefit in grid connected mode. And we work on modeling the resilience performance. That means the duration of how long you can last before your microgrid needs to go down and recover, how long that recovery period might take for your microgrid to recover and have enough power to serve you again. And then how long can you run after that till it fails again? Those are resilience metrics. And so we model that as well. So those are our kind of two areas, is like high fidelity economic modeling and high fidelity resilience modeling.
I like those very much. And, you know, so it's not that, just to be clear, because I have to say the disclaimer, it's not that we're recommending a particular company at all, but we are really recommending that more and more people educate themselves about what it is that, you know, how are we interacting, or where are the intersections in our lives with all of the systems that we depend on. One of the things that you talk about, which we're really interested in, is equity. And we like to say that the three most expensive words, or I like to say it, are equity, resiliency, and sustainability. So when you're talking about equity, you know, I love that you have gone, you know, northern Wisconsin. I think I got that right. And you have a tribal area, for example. I'm also thinking about, say I'm a supervisor in Plumas County, where I was last week in Greenville. And I've seen, you know, we have other challenges, but there are all kinds of problems in rural counties with broadband. There are huge issues with lack of access. There are, you know, lack of equity is actually not just the marginalized communities that we think of traditionally, but also people who simply don't have the capacity to come back from a natural disaster or the resiliency to sort of fend one off and communicate well. And it seems to me that, say if I'm a supervisor, I was at Supervisor Kevin Goss's house the other day, and he was defending it in Janesville. And I'm thinking, I want to put like, you know, 16 homes on a microgrid. Is that something that somebody could call a consultant like you and say, you know, how can we microgrid out and make it economically feasible? Or are we way too early in that technology for it to be common enough to be affordable for a county that only has 15,000 people in it?
Ooh, great questions. So first of all, yes, that would be a great time to call. And I will say that there have in the past been some regulatory hurdles to get over about the way that, you know, buildings, whether they're residences or commercial buildings, need to be connected to the grid and need to be metered. And that sometimes can stand in the way of how they can be microgridded together. But that's a very specific, like, you need to look at the site and see what the utility is on and, you know, all of that stuff. And so it's a very site specific thing. Totally agree with you. So energy equity has so many different flavors. Like, it could mean an ethnic or immigrant community that lives nearby a polluting fossil fuel based plant, or a fossil fuel based plant that was put into that community. Now the air quality is terrible, right? We see that a lot of Native American reservations are located at the ends of electrical feeders. And so there's no one beyond them. And so when something happens to infrastructure, they're often the last ones to be restored on those remote feeders. But it's not just Native Americans, and we want to protect our indigenous people, of course, but a lot of the people on the ends of feeders are rural farmers, ranchers. And so, who might be, white and a normal, a usual demographic. So it's not just about racial equity, although there's a piece of that for sure.
Sure. One does not diminish the other. Like,
right.
That's one of the things that I'm trying to get people to really understand, that just because you might serve one group doesn't mean you're leaving another group out. We're saying everybody deserves like a certain amount of equal access. And and wherever that's triggered is wherever it's triggered.
And it's also not a new problem that, these residents out on the ends of feeders and commercial operations, including farms and vineyards and ranches out on the ends of feeders, actually have a lot of problems with resilience. We tried to do a project with a farm that was out on the end of their feeder, and they actually wanted to put a significant amount of their growing indoors so that they could do it year round. They were growing lettuces, tomatoes, basil, that sort of thing. And they wanted to do it inside with lights, which is very electrically intensive. And not only did the power company tell them, we just can't supply that much power to you, but the natural gas company said, you're on the end of our feeder too, and we just can't supply that much natural gas to you. Like, it just wasn't there. Like, it did not exist. If they wanted to tap a new natural gas line, they were going to have to pay for it to be run 8 miles with 2 railroad crossings and a river. And that's just beyond prohibitively expensive.
Well, can you actually go a little more deeply into natural gas? Because natural gas seems to be one of those amorphous areas in between what's ecologically sound and what's a very bad idea. And it seems to be that it was touted as clean, and it's touted as sort of clean energy, but it's actually not the same time. So can you demystify that for our listeners?
Sure, absolutely. So personally, I don't demonize natural gas. So now I think you said it so well. It is way cleaner than coal. It's way cleaner than a lot of different kinds of, it's way cleaner than oil. It's even cleaner than like woody biomass, like wood chips or, trees and stuff like that, which in certain areas are viewed as a renewable energy source. But when you burn wood, even if the trees go back fast and you can create a sustainable cycle, you still cause air quality issues with burning wood.
But I'm going to say this, though. One of the things that we're really intent upon is getting wildfire into all communities across the Western United States instead of prohibiting it, because we've been prohibiting wildfire. We've been in this idea that every tree is precious and we should just plant more trees and stuff more trees in the forest. It's exactly what's making our forests less healthy, more vulnerable to wildfire, more vulnerable to climate change, more flammable. And so we are looking for people to sort of drop their political sacred cows. And we want environmentalists to sit with loggers and be like, how do we actually solve this? And biochar will be one of those paths that we can use as energy. But one of the things I like about what you're saying is you have to have diversity in your systems, and that will build resilience. I think that's what you're saying. So if I'm incorrect, please tell me.
No, totally. And, one of the native tribes that we worked with, and, they, as a tribe, they take a very holistic approach to looking at the impacts of what their choices are. And I've learned so much about design process for them and holistic design. And that's, they struggle with that because they see themselves, this particular tribe sees themselves as the stewards of the forest. And one of the things about being stewards of the forest is culling when you need to cull, cleaning up scrap. And they were like, it would be great to do, a biomass plant with wood to solve this problem. And then they actually have their own air quality people who are like, oh, and so there's no right answer here. There's, how can we mitigate it? Can we do carbon recapture? Are there other options? So back to natural gas, I see it as sort of a similar thing that is way cleaner than coal or oil. It's still a fossil fuel, so it's not a renewable asset. And eventually we're going to run out of easy to access resource for it. However, right now, it is a better step than we had before. It's more likely to be centralized generation than distributed, but sometimes that's not the case. One of the use cases for natural gas I really love is called CHP. That stands for combined heat and power. And basically it means that you have a massive generator engine that's burning natural gas to produce electricity, but then you're capturing the heat off of that and using it to make steam or hot water or some other form of heat that you can then distribute and glean the heat off of it too. What we were looking at for like industrial indoor farming was a CHP based solution. And that was why we were taking a look at if they could get natural gas to the farm. It's actually a really symbiotic relationship, because not only in the winter do they need to power their lighting, they need to heat so that the plants don't freeze, but they were buying bottled carbon dioxide to put inside the greenhouse to encourage plant growth, because plants like carbon dioxide. And so with a CHP plant, with a natural gas fired plant, you can recapture carbon dioxide and feed it to the plants.
I love that.
And so total symbiotic relationship, very few emissions from the natural gas fired plant. And so, yeah, there's no reason to like demonize any fuel source except, I guess, coal. I would probably say that would be the one that should probably not be around very much longer.
I'm actually still not being political, but really hoping that in all of this infrastructure investment, that part of that goes into retraining people who are solely dependent for their incomes and their skill sets on, coal and petroleum, that they have the opportunity to become part of the new greener economy and contribute to that and not be left behind.
Totally.
I think that would be a game changer for many communities across the United States. And why I do think, like, why are we giving away our, like, the green economy to China, which is essentially what we've sort of given it for the last decade, and they're just racing ahead. And a lot of the costs will come down for things like solar because they've made massive investments and in infrastructure in other countries too. It's a very interesting thing to watch.
Well, also like my example earlier of like everyone now has a laptop and it's their controller for their microgrid. There's so much more opportunity for technicians, for people who need to understand these systems, how to work, how to troubleshoot them, how to fix them. Yeah, there's with microgrids, like any kind of like computer controlled system, there's a certain amount of like, you can plug it, unplug it and plug it back in. Like that's the first thing you try. But like
always
there's definitely, I work with a woman who lives in LA, and she runs a company who does operations and maintenance for electric vehicle charging stations. And that was, before I met her, that was something I did not even think about. That like, and part of her thing is workforce development, that like we need a cadre of people trained, and they're not just a general licensed electrician, because 9 times out of 10, the problem isn't with the electricity. It's something else to do with the actual charger architecture. So you have to know about the charger, and that's a new job. That's a new green economy job.
And you don't need to go to 4 years of college to learn how to do that. Like, that's not for everybody. Like so I also like that part of it too, because that's just not an option for many people. But we need a workforce that's absolutely trained up in what I was a high school teacher for a decade. And I used to say to my students, we are training you for jobs that don't even exist yet. So let's look at what skills you'll need, like critical thinking. That was my wheelhouse right there. But how do you seed the ground now by just starting to shift our economy away from fossil fuels, away from maintenance, away from extraction and into creation?
Well, first of all, that's a beautiful thing to say. I need to like write that one down. But it's not just true for, for technician jobs. It's true all across the job chain. And like, my story, when my generation of, energy industry workers, engineers, there wasn't a course to take like sustainability engineering in college. And even if there was, it was one small corner of civil engineering, and people were like, I don't know what you would ever do with that. So I'm an aerospace engineer. I worked on spacecraft design, integration, and operation. And what is a microgrid what is a spacecraft except a microgrid, right? It has
that's such a good point. I love that. Yeah.
It has to generate its own electricity, store it, control it, distribute it. And if it breaks, you're in really bad trouble. You can't just send out a guy with a wrench to go fix it. My business partner is an electrical engineer, and he was trained in integrated circuit design, and he laughs because, chips, making computer chips. And he laughs because when he was in school as an electrical engineer, there were a couple of like power engineering courses, like, talking about like high voltage transmission and like the calculations behind the power flow analysis. And he laughs because he's like, I didn't pay attention in those because I didn't, when was I ever going to use that? Like, but
it's like people who are really good at cursive.
Right.
And they were just leaning fully into that, and, not because they just, it's hard to know at the time though. It's a very human response because you just don't know. You don't know what you don't know.
And so I think it's a lesson to all of us to be adaptable in, as we evolve in the new energy economy, is to say, so what my partner did was, he said, look, chips require very rigorous modeling, because when you build a computer chip, you basically send the drawing off to the fab and they make it at the fab. And when it comes back, you can't fix it. There's no way to like make a change. So you better be sure that your design was correct. And the way you do that is that you model it. You model the heck out of it before you send that design away. And so he brought that rigor and modeling. So he happened to work at the National Renewable Energy Lab for 7 years, revolutionizing the way they did modeling before we joined forces and we started this business where we work on modeling. And sort of similar, with me, that like obviously working on spacecraft is really fun and really awesome. And I had this yearning to work on something that felt even more meaningful and direct in terms of supporting the planet, a crisis of our time. And so, I love working in energy because to me, it's supporting the planet in terms of green, sustainable energy. And it's also supporting people and in terms of community resilience and the equity we talked about. And so like that fusion, it's like you can nail so many different problems at one central hub of a project, of a career, of an industry, with what we're doing here. And that totally appeals to me.
I love that. And I'm not going to make, I am curious about, entering into this space. Are you seeing, you're obviously a female in a very male dominated space. So are you seeing more interest from women in entering into the space of being an engineer? And I'm just curious from a human perspective.
Well, it's interesting because in aerospace specifically, we had a pretty good ratio. It's not to say it wasn't, majority male. It still was, but I definitely when I was working in corporate engineering, I definitely had a lot of women teams. In fact, one of my teams that just landed a spacecraft on the asteroid Bennu. They called it a tag. They tagged the asteroid and picked up some rocks and then left to bring it back to Earth. And the person who designed that maneuver was a friend of mine who's a woman. And her team was all female, actually, to design that maneuver. Now the larger team has men on it, but it was such a moment of triumph to do that. I will say that moving into the energy industry from aerospace, I have been the only woman in the room or on the call like way more often. It's even more male dominated. And that was a thing that I started to make a list of the women that I knew. It actually hit me. It was Mother's Day a couple of years ago where I was like, I'm going to go wish my colleagues a happy Mother's Day because I would like that. I would like my colleagues to wish me a happy Mother's Day. So I'm going to go wish my colleagues. And I went to go make my list of mothers that I could wish happy Mother's Day to. And I was like, I think I have like 3 on my list that I could wish happy Mother's Day to. And I was like, wow. So I started to make a list of just all the women that I know. And I actually do have a pretty substantive list. And I'm like, why don't we hear from women more? And, there are energy, at the conferences, in the media, the energy media, we tend to hear the same voices all the time, and certainly the same demographic of voices. So that's what inspired. I actually am starting my own podcast. It's called Power Flow,
Nice.
and it is featuring particularly women, but feminism is nothing if it's not intersectional. So also other underrepresented voices, gender minorities and racial minorities in the energy industry. And it's for that reason, to demonstrate that like, there's not just, we're here, you know, and we have a great perspective on things. We tend to think very holistically. You know, we tend to have technical expertise, but then also are able to also hold space for non-technical issues at the same time that we hold space for technical issues, which is a real gift and it's a real skill. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, that's definitely something that I'm passionate about, is like bringing these, you know, bringing more diverse voices to the table, bringing more voices to the innovation whiteboard that are able to hold space for different problems at the same time.
And I think to be really clear, it's not about diminishing or devaluing the contribution of men or white men in particular. It's very much about like, how can we be even better if we make more space for more points of view and more, you know, types of intelligence or values, because that's how we're going to actually get better in all fields. And I work in a field, you know, I run a nonprofit that's just teeming with female leaders. And so it would be great to see sort of that intersection come more and more and more together. But I think when we see people who look like us doing jobs, then we tend to think those are the jobs that we're supposed to do. And the more women and, you know, traditionally underrepresented communities that are shown on your podcast in your field, then you're going to have kids, especially who look at that and be like, you know what, I could totally do that. And, you know, one day we'll have a female president and then they'll say, I think I could do that too.
Do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I'm a big fan of, I think I could do that no matter who that is, because what I'm not a big fan of is somebody looking at something and thinking I can't do that by virtue of just, you know, my gender or my ethnicity, but instead I just want to open up things for everybody without, I'm not trying. I think too often people just see it as a zero-sum game and then they get very panicked about that. And you're like, not really, that's not really the deal. And one of the other things we're getting like, it's a little bit social justice, but there have always been contributions from women in engineering or women in medicine or women in other areas, or people who are traditionally under-recognized. But not only are they underrepresented, but they're also under-recognized. And so we tend to just ignore those narratives or exclude them. And so I like the fact that you're going to have this podcast. I hope that you send us the link and that so that we can put it in there. And I also want to make sure that people know that they can contact you at Simpkins.com. We are going to put your links in the description so they can contact you directly, because I think your point of view is innovative and interesting and important.
Thank you. And the last thing here I'll say is that fundamentally, I'm an innovation nerd. I want to see innovation happen. And I've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about like how I see innovation happening from my chair. And a fundamental principle of innovation is that if you want more diversity of ideas and possibilities, you need to have more diverse brains in the room.
Yes.
And that's not a diminishment of anyone. In fact, that's an elevation of everyone.
I agree.
And there's a problem on the other side of that, is that, okay, now you have all these amazing ideas. How do you then converge on an approach? But we're not even close. We're not even close there yet.
And you know what, that's not a bad problem to have. Like, it's not always easy, but it can be even uncomfortable. But you know, why not just get comfortable with being uncomfortable? If we're going to come to a better solution on the other side, and if it takes, you know, some fits and starts and you know, uncomfortable moments, who cares? Like, if we end up on the other side more resilient and we can live in better harmony with our environments, like, we are looking at the fact that we have to live alongside wildfire here, and that is the reality of it. And we have a long, scary decade or 2 or 3 ahead of us. But there is a different way from how we've been doing it. And the only way we can actually get through that is to build self-reliance, but also to innovate. And people like you are going to help make that happen. And I really want to thank you for being on the podcast today. And I just want to ask you, is there any question that I haven't asked, or anything you want to leave our listeners with, knowing that we haven't touched upon?
I think just final thought here is that I know that resilience can look a lot of different ways. It can have a lot of different definitions. And for some people, it means I just lost everything in a wildfire. And how do I start again? And in other ways, it looks like I recognize that there's a threat out there and that we're going to have to live with the threat of wildfires or earthquake or whatever. And I'm willing to take action now to do the best I can to prepare our community for that. And so holding space for all of those different sort of definitions of resilience and facets of it is important.
I love that. And also holding space for the stories of resilience. KQED Science did this story recently. They promoted it on Twitter, and the reporter said, please retweet this so that my editors will know that we should do more stories about communities that were spared wildfire because they took these particular steps. And it's not to diminish the other communities. It's kind of like, oh, how do you even begin to do that? You're going to have to show stories of success for us all to also puzzle over the problem together. And I also appreciate just the different types of brains like yours. I am not an engineer, but I can tell you that every time I cross a bridge, I think one. I'm not an armchair scientist either. And so I just have a lot of respect for the amount of training that you've had to go through and the amount of education and your dedication to making, the world a little bit better in your corner of it and bringing your talents.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
It's a big deal. So thank you so much for being on the podcast, How to Disaster. This has been Amy Simpkins. Again, you can reach her through her website, which we will link in the comments. And we will see you next time. Thank you. Thank you for joining us on the podcast, How to Disaster. For more information, please visit our website at afterthefireusa.org. And if you liked this video, please hit subscribe.
Navigating the recovery process after a fire is challenging, particularly with the additional issues caused by COVID-19. Fannie Mae is here to help. If you live in a FEMA-declared disaster area, you can request free assistance from our Disaster Response Network. Fannie Mae, in partnership with Mori Management International's Project Porchlight, launched the Disaster Response Network in 2018. This program uses HUD-approved counselors to offer support. These counselors have been specially trained as disaster coaches. They address the challenges homeowners and renters face when recovering from a disaster. There's no charge for their services. The goal of the Disaster Response Network is to help people return to pre-disaster normal as quickly as possible. Clients are matched with a coach who work with them one-on-one throughout their recovery. In the initial conversation with clients, coaches review the status of the homeowner's recovery process, including current challenges, decisions that need to be made, and immediate long-term goals. They discuss topics like income and expenses, insurance, housing, credit or debt challenges, as well as aid or other assistance programs that may be available. This may include FEMA applications and Small Business Administration, or SBA, loans. The coach helps the client plan and prioritize the next steps for their recovery. Moving forward, the coach continues to be there for the client, reaching out to them regularly, at least monthly, but more often when needed, for up to 18 months' time. These regular check-ins provide the client the opportunity to ask questions, get help tackling challenges, and keep things moving as they work through their recovery. It's also where coaches can help identify new recovery assistance or grants that have become available, strategize new next steps for recovery, and talk through difficult decisions or priorities. One of the key ways coaches assist Disaster Response Network clients is by helping intervene when something has gone awry. Coaches will, with the clients on the line, call insurance companies to adjust their claims when costs exceed initial estimates, or call the client's creditors to request payment relief. The Disaster Response Network's approach ensures survivors have a personal financial expert working with them throughout their recovery. By helping minimize the financial impact of a disaster, survivors can recover more quickly. To get confidential disaster relief assistance, call the Disaster Response Network at 877-833-1746. Once again, that is 877-833-1746. Or visit knowyouroptions.com/relief for more information.